Today we're going to cover the ability to set your own recruiting benchmarks using historic ATS data. And I'm going to cover two approaches. The first one is to actually look at historics and then figure out where you were and how to segment that out by different profiles, by team, seniority, function, so that you can actually get some realistic benchmarks for your own history. And then the second, actually my favorite part, is actually creating an ideal benchmark. So not based on any external metric, but actually based on what you believe is theoretically the optimum path when you're thinking about all the different benchmarks. Of course, the other standard that most people take is using competitor benchmarks. I don't like that approach for a number of reasons. One is it's usually hard to get hold of them. Two, they really don't necessarily reflect on what you're doing internally. And then three, if all you're doing is trying to beat or come close to your competitors, you're never actually going to lead the field. And so by actually focusing on improving your historics and identifying where those gaps are, or actually looking at the ideal candidate journey, you can actually get to a much better place overall and create a really robust recruiting process. So there's going to be two resources from this session. Go into the resources section on the Talent Academy, and it'll be one of the new featured resources if you're watching this immediately after launch. Otherwise, it should sit somewhere down here, and it's going to be one of the kind of toolkits with prompt libraries kind of built in. So that's what we're doing today. I will jump into the actual walkthrough. So there's two things that you can use here. One is the prompt pack. We're going to use Claude for Excel today, so you can copy and paste this to a chatbot or use actually Google's new Gemini integration. I'm going to use Claude for Excel just because it's pretty robust. I've gotten quite comfortable using that recently. And then the other file that you'll find in the download is this sample ATS export. So I tried to take like a mid-sized company that's doing a lot of hiring and just generate a kind of sample ATS data pool. You may already have access to this within the ATS and you don't need to do all the exporting and the prompting and everything else, but I'm going to give you the bare bones, and then you can kind of adapt this to how you want to use it in practice. And so within the ATS export, we have a few tabs. You have the applications tab, which gives you the kind of row for every applicant that you've had for all your different recs. You have a requisitions tab, which is going to give you every kind of rec, whether it's kind of open or closed, and you can see the status on the right hand side here. And you've got your recruiters tab. This just gives you the total number of recruiters. What's critical here is the fully loaded cost, because we're going to be looking at cost per hire at some point, at least just to set up a baseline. Obviously that's going to change based on how you measure cost per hire, but it's something that a lot of people ask for, so I decided to include it in here. I'm not going to go into all the rows and columns of this data set, because the focus here is on the ability to use the prompts to get access to your data and to get the insights that you need. So we're going to kick it off. Before we do anything, what I want to do is actually just give Claude the opportunity to review the overall file and take a look at what we've got, make sure that the numbers that they're seeing when they actually analyze the data is the same as what we expect. So what I've asked it to do is look through the rows, all the values and the columns, just to do a quick data check, and then tell me how many recs we have open, what the distribution of that is. So I hope that's going to come back pretty quickly and give us the kind of insights that we need. Usually runs quite quickly. And then as we go through the prompt pack here, there's two packs. Pack A is setting benchmarks based on your own historical data. So that's the approach that most people will take. Pack B is actually borrowed from what we used to do in the customer experience teams I worked in, where you look at the ideal customer journey and then you look at how far off that journey your kind of typical process is. And that gives you kind of key areas where you can target and actually improve the experience for everyone involved. So it's going to come back here. We're just going to check to make sure that we're comfortable with the feedback it's given us. So total number of applications, it's given us 6,500. I've already checked that 30 columns. And we can just do a quick check here. So yeah, it's 6,500 total applications. We've got 30 columns. And vocabulary, yep, everything looks correct, as it should do, because everything was generated by Claude. So now we know we have the data set all kind of mapped up. Now we're going to actually start to look at the right kind of way to dissect this data and then figure out how we're actually going to measure performance. The first thing I want to do is actually look at clusters. Now, I'm going to get this running and explain a little bit about what I mean by clusters. So a cluster is generally kind of a logical grouping of data points together. And so if you think about this from a recruiting perspective, you know that if you have a large recruiting function, you're recruiting for kind of junior, mid-level, senior, executive roles. You're recruiting for technical, non-technical, sales, marketing, frontline ops. All these recruitment processes are going to be a little bit different. And so what we actually want to do is, rather than do an average time to hire for the whole cohort, we actually want to first cluster them into logical breakouts so that we understand, based on a kind of like a critical number of applications or recs closed, we can actually combine them together and give meaningful insights into the metrics behind that cluster, rather than kind of analyzing everything together. So you can see here it's actually made some interesting reports. So if we look at number and hires of Claude recs, so what it's done is set a threshold. So in order for a cluster to be valid, we want at least 5 hires and at least 3 closed recs. And there are a number of reasons for that. As you look at averages across large data sets, really you need 15 and ideally 30 plus data points in order to start to create what we call like a standard distribution or a normal distribution, where you can actually infer metrics from that. And so it's gone through all the different approaches that it could take and how it might want to cluster them together. So primary clusters, department, seniority, and country. That makes a lot of sense. Secondary cuts. So we're not going to set benchmarks, but work model and source. And the reason it's gone for that is because we do have key sources here. So what this could potentially tell us is, if we're hiring engineers, do we hire them better from LinkedIn or from GitHub? We don't have enough data points to actually infer that, so it's gonna make that cut, but we're not actually gonna use that as a meaningful data point with this data set. If you had 10x the number of rows that we're currently working with, maybe you could do something like that. And then work model, hybrid, remote, on-site. Again, it's probably not really that helpful, so it's not going to make those recommendations. And so these are the recommendations that we're going to go with. And so we now know that that's the cluster that we're going to use. So the next thing we're going to do is use time-based benchmarks, which is going to give us time to fill, time to hire, time in stage. And that's a good diagnostic tool when we want to look at how long does it actually take to fill a role. And generally when you work with a hiring manager, that's the thing they care about the most. It's like, when I open this rec, when am I actually going to have that person in the seat? And analyzing historic data is going to give us a good baseline for that. But also, hopefully, if we look at time in stage, we can figure out where the potential gaps are so that we can actually drill down and figure out how to improve that. So what we've asked it to do is create a new sheet called benchmarks time. So we should see that pop up in just a second. And what it's going to do is take all of our data, and then hopefully, if everything goes well, within the clusters that we've created, it's going to create those benchmark metrics, looking at our historic data. And so we can figure out kind of where we stand based on those metrics. Once we've done this, we're going to look at the funnel conversion benchmarks, source of hire and cost per hire benchmarks, recruiter performance benchmarks, which is actually where a lot of questions come from. It's like, what goals should I set for my recruiting team and the individuals within it? And then D&I benchmarks, so diversity funnel, and then finally an executive summary, where we should hopefully have something that we can kind of copy and paste and give to a leader to kind of communicate this analysis back out. And this kind of goes with the overall framework that we have implemented in the Talent Academy, where we start with the analysis of the data. We then use AI to actually become more productive ourselves as we kind of implement the recommendations based on our analysis. And then we figure out how do we communicate that back up to a leadership team so that we get the recommendation that we want implemented. It's given us a summary. So manager lead time to fill is 85 days, which is 25 days longer than mid to junior. So intuitively, we know that's going to be correct. This is kind of a good indication that the clustering that we did, where we've broken out manager and lead from mid to junior. And so we actually have these two clusters. And so when someone opens a new rec and says this is a lead engineer or whatever, we can actually estimate when that role is going to be closed compared to if it was a junior. And if we look in the actual days here, so we look at kind of time to hire. So we look at overall time to hire for by seniority, which is where we were called out. We can see the median time to hire. This is interesting because it looks the same to me. Okay, so I think this is where it's coming from, is time to fill versus time to hire. So maybe this is accounting for longer notice periods, or it could just be that the data doesn't work very well. But the junior to mid level is 60 days time to fill. The manager to lead is 85 days. Mid is somewhere in between. And this is where we might want to kind of play around with the clustering a little bit if this is not really all that helpful. But we can see the breakdown by country as well. We know US is the shortest, UK is the longest. There's not a whole lot in it. I think a lot of this is based on random number generation. So I'm not going to go too in depth on whether this is kind of believable. but really just focus on the kind of process that we can go through, and you can interpret that based on what you know about your roles. But we can also look at time in stage, and so we can look at kind of applied to recruiter, recruiter screen to hiring manager screen. And from here, one of the things that I would probably want to do is actually start to do a conditional formatting with a color scale, where we can actually start to look at, let's reverse that, what are the shortest periods and what are the longest periods. And so very quickly you can see by department how the different stages in the recruiting process vary. And offer to hired is always going to be the longest here, because if you think about kind of notice periods or negotiation periods or anything like that, we kind of have a pretty wide variance there. But one thing that stands out here is we have a technical screen to on-site of 12.5 days for engineering, whereas our product roles are 7.5 days. So the question there is, what are we doing on the product recruiting process that we can mirror on the engineering recruiting process and save 5 days in that kind of time to fill process? And likewise, how are we getting from applied to recruiter screen in 5 days on data and 7 days on sales? And so, if you take the kind of smallest of each stage and you figure out what they're doing well and replicate that across the whole team, what you can find is that if we just take the smallest one from each one, 5 days and 15.5 days. So the total time to fill here is 42.5, whereas our average for the whole kind of function is 49. So if we can actually drill down into each of these stages and figure out by function what they're doing well and how to mirror that into other functions, we could potentially cut off a whole week of hiring time across all of our departments, which is going to be a huge win. So that's just how I would think about this metric. More important metrics may be funnel conversion. So we're just going to load that up now and just see if we get kind of any meaningful insights from there. So again, this is stage-to-stage pass-through rate. When looking at time in stage, which is kind of one of my favorite areas to dig into, we can then look at conversion rates and see, is there a correlation between time in stage and conversion rates, to the point where maybe we're actually loading up in certain areas and not filtering as effectively as we could. And if we're passing too many people through to a technical screen, and the technical screen takes a long time to schedule because there's only a few people that can actually do the technical screen, then we're going to create this backlog, and that's going to increase overall time to fill. But that's how I would think about that kind of like next stage of the process, like taking the time and stage metrics, comparing them to the funnel conversion metrics, and then kind of seeing what patterns we can understand, create a hypothesis around why that's happening, and then figure out how to change it by comparing it with ideal paths. I'm going to just drop everything else in here just so that we can start moving through the process a little bit faster. I'm going to wait for that to finish analyzing. Okay, so we've got the data back from the time and stage and the funnel conversion rates. So now we can actually look through company-wide benchmarks and figure out what makes the most sense to goal for our recruiting team if we're actually going to go on by pass-through rates. So 20% of applied get a recruiter screen, just over 50% go from recruiter to hiring manager. Again, another 50% to technical. Only 40% of those get to on-site, and then 50% of on-sites goes to offer, and offer to hire is 44%. So what I'm seeing is that the technical to on-site is pretty low. I think we want to be figuring out how do we screen more of those people out at the top of the funnel where the time commitment is less, so that when they get to on-site, we're actually getting a higher pass-through rate. And even the on-site to offer is only 50%. We probably want that to be higher so that we can not waste our time with on-site interviews with people that should have been screened out earlier in the process. And then what's also telling here is offer to hired is only 44%. I think once you know that you want to hire someone, if you're not closing them, there's clearly something wrong in either the sales process or the package that's being offered or the kind of positioning of the role. And so I'd really want to kind of dig into what that is, because all the work that's been put in here is only getting 44% yield once you actually offer someone the role, once you figured out how to solve the package. Or you actually reposition the whole funnel so that you're increasing the hired rate by filtering more people through the funnel. All right, so here's the kind of next stage of the process where we've actually looked at source and cost per hire. This is maybe a little conservative in the numbers, so we can see based on the scale, reliability, and review of the different channels that we could potentially look at. The cheapest channels are GitHub. That's kind of one hire, so it's not really a meaningful data point. Agency hire is the most expensive, which we know. Employee referrals are a little cheaper, which again, we know that's probably the case. But this is just helpful benchmarking data to have if you're going to be kind of making recommendations to a senior leader of how to actually do channel distribution moving forward. Next, we're going to set our recruiter performance benchmarks. So we actually want to look at by recruiter, how many recs should they own, how many did they close, hires made, and then look at actual benchmark metrics. So now we're getting to the point where we've analyzed all of our historic data. Now we're actually going to look at by recruiter. And so if you're a recruiting leader and you're trying to set benchmarks for your individuals within your team, this is the point that you're actually going to get that clean data, because we've already done the upfront analysis and we know whether what we're actually saying is reasonable. Okay, so we've got our recruiter benchmarks back. One thing that's called out is the number of requisitions is relatively small. I think in practice this would be much higher. And so we can see here how our current recruiters have performed against the average. So you're comparing these against everyone else within the team. You see Marcus is above average if you look across the kind of performance metrics that we're looking at here, and Priya is below average, and this is just really comparing number of hires. I think the data here is it's not really accounting for the nuance of the roles. We did that great work early on clustering and understanding the performance by function. So I think from this, what I would then want to do is actually go a little bit deeper on what roles were they hiring for. Were Marcus's roles all relatively straightforward, and Priya's roles are kind of more difficult and more executive focused? So actually comparing kind of just the metrics without context is going to be quite difficult. And I would probably prompt this to actually then go back and look at the actual data points themselves and do a little bit more work on that. We're actually going to look through the next prompt, which is looking at diversity metrics. Generally, this is, we've seen this really flagged for US-based roles where there are kind of clear diversity targets or clear efforts to improve the overall representation within teams. And we know that that leads to stronger performance. And so we're going to go through that process, and anywhere where we've got a data point that we can actually use to give ourselves some meaningful metrics, which is only a small number of data points in this set, is going to give us just some clearer indications. We look at the benchmark data that we've got here, and again, this is useful for setting key results. If one of your objectives is to increase representation across the organization, recruiting is the key place where you do that. You've also got retention, but just focused on the ATS data, we can actually start to look at the kind of benchmarks and create our own benchmarks from what we've done in the past, and then suggest what we could meaningfully improve, and that becomes the baseline for our data and measurement moving forward. And you can always kind of go back and assess what's happened in the past. And so right here we can see, and I think Claude's going to give me a summary on the side here to let me know what the actual outlook looks like. So again, we have only looked at the US pool. We've excluded a bunch of data points where we don't have that. We had some non-binary applicants, and so there's a question there around where do we kind of include those. And we're starting to get some outputs now. Okay, so we've got our data points back. You can see how it's broken down by gender and ethnicity, which is generally the kind of two main buckets that we would maybe want to look at. It looks at the transition across stages in the recruiting process to see, is there anywhere in the process that we are kind of eliminating people that could be worth further investigation just by looking solely at the ethnicity. What we'd want to see is all of these should be about the same, so they should all be overall. So if any group is significantly higher or lower than the average, we want to investigate why that is and try and understand it a little bit more. The key issue here is going to be the number of data points you have. So if you're only dealing with a small handful of data points, it's not going to give you that kind of insight that I think you're going to need. And so we'll move ahead to the final one, which is our executive summary. And so this is where we're actually going to bring everything back together and say, okay, we've analyzed our 2025 ATS data. We've looked at who we've hired. We've looked at all the benchmarks that we believe are important. Here's where we're actually going to recommend the way that we benchmark for 2026, or wherever you're actually going to benchmark. And that's going to give us kind of the key metrics. So while that's calculating, I'm going to touch on the pack B, which is the theoretical ideal hiring path, just to give you some headline as to what we're actually doing there. if you think of a perfect candidate experience where you kind of go end to end, you move through each process, as quickly as is reasonably practicable, and you go to the end and receive an offer, what does that process look like? And then once you've got that, you can compare it to everyone else's process that has gone through that funnel and actually understand where you're kind of losing candidates because the process isn't as effective as it should be. So we'll touch on that next. We'll come back to this one. So we have got some good metrics here. We can look at time to hire by department. We can look at estimated offer accept rate. We can look at headline benchmarks that we might want to report up to the board. And from here, we can actually drill down into all of the tabs that we've just created. Because we now have that data, we've understood it. We've probably gone through it a lot slower than what I've done on this video, but that's going to give you that hiring benchmark so you understand all the data, bring it all together and set clean benchmarks for your team that won't get pushback from the senior leadership because you can actually ground it in real data from history and with hopefully a slight improvement and the kind of 3 big initiatives that you're going to take in order to drive that improvement forward. So that's how I would think about historic analysis to set recruiting benchmarks without having to rely on competitor data. Next, we're actually going to jump into this theoretical ideal hiring path. Before I jump into that, quick call out that we do have the new Talent Academy live. So if you like this kind of insight, you actually want to go a little bit deeper, want to join a community and get access to office hours and the kind of updated modules, additional resources that we don't share publicly on YouTube, please go to the Talent Academy. Click on the courses, you can see all the courses that we have live. We just launched the Applied AI for HR course, which is essentially 3 hours of content with a whole bunch of resources, about 4.5 hours when you go through all the exercises yourself. It's eligible for SHRM recertification credits, and it's going to be constantly updated as we get new information and new insights. It's a subscription package, so you can subscribe for a month, take all the courses, get what you need, cancel your subscription, there's no commitment. But what I'm hoping is that you'll keep coming back, and as we release new modules each month, you'll stay up to date with what's going on and actually really stay ahead of the pack with your learning. Okay, so let's jump into the theoretical ideal hiring path. And I'm just going to paste this prompt directly into here, and then we're going to talk about what we're asking Claude for Excel to do. And so this is actually creating a whole new sheet. And as I mentioned, we're actually going to take the ideal path for what we think is theoretically possible for a candidate going end to end throughout the process. And we're going to compare that with what we think should be, or what we've actually done in 2025 based on the actual data we have. And so it's looking through kind of the theory of the actual recruitment process. It's pulling data from our sheet, and then it's going to give us this kind of ideal path. We've set it up for a 500-person company using modern ATS. We're asking it to actually get industry conventions from any published data it has access to. This is the beauty of using an LLM. It actually has this data already embedded within. And then once this is done, we're going to create an ideal versus actual sheet. And then we're going to be able to go into the diagnosis of everything there. We've got our data back, which means that we can now start to analyze and see, okay, where are we against the ideal hiring path? So I'm going to get the next prompt kicked off straight away, and then we're going to actually look through what we've got back. So what we're doing now is taking this ideal hiring path, and then we're going to compare it to what we actually did. Hopefully it's going to be pretty quickly because we've already went through that process with the analysis of our historic data sets. So if we kind of close this over for a second and zoom in a little bit, we actually start to look at what the ideal hiring path looks like. And so from here, we can say this is actually pulled from public sources. So this is, when you think about historic benchmark data from competitors, this is what we're kind of referring to. And instead of having to go to like one source, we're actually aggregating across a number of different ones. But what's helpful here is this is just a starting point. So, from this, we can then start to question whether this is actually believable and actually come up with a kind of first principles approach to setting benchmark data that we would then use moving forward. And that then becomes our own benchmark data. And so we're setting our own standards, and hopefully they will then become much better than what any of our competitors are doing and gives us that kind of clear leadership position. But we look at time and stage, we can see how it's kind of summarized all of these and then come up with recommendation for overall kind of applied to higher time to fill. Now we're saying, well, why can't the manager and lead position be 37 days instead of whatever it was earlier. Ideal conversion rates, again, we can look at the kind of funnel conversion. So I did say, why is our offer to hire so low? It should be, double the kind of 40% that it was. And this actually confirms that that's actually a reasonable expectation. Sherm suggests 85 to 90%. And even through the rest of the funnel, we saw that our overall conversions were a little low. That feeds directly into this timing stage in kind of actually figuring out what's happening in the flow of the process. Ideal process design, again, this is looking at what the ideal process should look like. It's helpful to have so that we can actually look at the stages in our process. And when we actually drill down and get into the weeds of each stage, we can see, are we actually following these principles, or are there different principles that we want to implement as an organization that are different from this? And then ideal cost, and so this is looking at kind of cost per hire. I think this is a reasonable expectation for at least setting benchmarks of what the cost per hire could be, and then we kind of build on top of that with all of the expectations, all the different things that we load onto our recruiters. And so when we actually look at the actual versus ideal, which we've just created, we can see where we have a gap, where we're kind of close, and where we're actually on track. And so these are all the metrics that we know are working well. These are the ones that aren't. It's actually stack ranked by the delta roughly. So we can see, okay, offer to hire for junior to mid-level is very low. So ideally we should have 3, and it's actually 10.5. And so what we need to do is figure out, why is it taking 7.5 more days than the ideal to get someone from an offer to hired? And especially if this is kind of junior level roles, what's actually driving that? Is it the way we're measuring the performance? Is it the negotiations taking too long? And can we actually drive that up? And what's helpful here is there's 38 of those examples. And so if we can actually make a change where we cut this, we get to the halfway point, we've actually saved a significant number of lost days in the hiring process that are going to translate to business performance, because we get people in seat much sooner. And generally, if we're closing sooner, it also can correlate to improved quality of the people within those roles. So that's where I would kind of look at actuals versus hire. There's a couple more things that we're going to do. We're actually looking at diagnosing of the top 3 gaps, which are kind of the ones that we're covering here. What you can see is it's actually grayed out the processes where we have a very low N. And this is something that's really critical, because if you just solve the problems that look the biggest when we're looking at the overall delta, you may actually not going to have as big of an impact as if you were solving based on the kind of overall volume. And this is just prioritizing the ones that have the highest volume of total hires or total kind of data points in the funnel. But you may actually have different priorities within the organization. So, if you know that there's a big product launch coming up and you need to staff the product team, what I would actually do is resegment this to focus only on product-based roles and figure out where are the biggest gaps within the product team and how can I actually solve those. So offer to hire, we just talked about that. So we can see Priya, we'd mentioned Priya earlier, is one of the kind of underperformers. She's at 16 days. David Rodriguez is at 7 days. So it's still higher than it should be. But why are Priya and Marcus taking twice as long as David? So then we can look at David's process. We figure out, what is David doing correctly? What is Priya and Marcus not doing that David's doing? And then how can we bridge the gap and actually get them closer together? So we look at by country. What is it about the UK that is 3 days faster than the US? What is it about people marketing that's better than engineering? And so, all these kind of things we can dig into. And you can see it's coming up with the offer to higher accept rate for junior to mid. It's got 2 for manager to lead as well. So it's actually kind of creating the biggest gaps. And actually, because these are all so similar, we're probably going to uncover patterns that we can actually apply in these different areas. And so that's a really helpful kind of approach to take. Role-specific ideal process, we can actually then create by roles. This is actually going a little bit deeper than this kind of overall big picture. What is the ideal process if we just take the industry benchmarks for kind of the average, and then we can actually go a little bit deeper, role specific by process. And then the final part is this single number scoreboard, which means we're going to create this final hiring scoreboard. And what I would do here is use this as kind of a baseline for how are we scoring performance, and then revisit this each month. And I would do this with the kind of TA monthly all hands or direct reports meeting, and actually just compare actuals for the month that just passed to what we believe they should be. Celebrate wins, actually dissect by team, by recruiter, and understand where the gaps are coming from, and not just call out what's going wrong, but actually figure out how to improve it using the power of the tools that we have available here. Okay, so now we have the analysis back. on the top 5 roles by volume. So these are the kind of like the 5 roles that we're hiring the most of across the organization. We're actually doing kind of a drill down to figure out what's going on here. Rather than go into the sheet, we'll just look at the summary here. So looking at the divergence of bilingual support specialist, account executive, security engineer, and we're seeing like where they're scored. So we probably want to look at the redesign where we can actually have the biggest impact. So divergence here is 83% for bilingual support specialist. We're almost 12 days over the ideal candidate journey and 23 points below where the offer accept rate should be. On-site pipeline, we don't have the data for. But if we actually drill into this a little bit more, we can probably identify where we're seeing the biggest challenges and actually work to fix those. And so if we only focus on these 5 roles and we improve these quarter over quarter, we should see a huge improvement in performance in the next quarter. So the final piece we're going to do is the single number scorecard, as I just mentioned. So we'll run that and then we'll talk through that, and that will be the end of this walkthrough. Okay, so we've got our hiring scoreboard back. The idea behind this final one is so that you can actually communicate it to a leadership team, to your individual team, and really focus on what you're going to fix in the coming months, the coming quarter, so that you improve performance of the overall recruiting function based on the benchmarks that we've set, which are based on ideal candidate journeys and also our own historic data with some priority actions to fix. So let's just take a quick look at this and we'll move ahead. So overall score, we're at 74 out of 100, we're kind of mid in terms of overall performance. Target is to improve by 8 points, so we'll get up to 82. That's going to get us back into the green. Speed, we've actually weighted these. Time to hire is a little higher than we would want. Where the gap is coming from. Conversion says it's good. I would actually argue that this is not so good. Overall efficiency, the cost per hire is pretty good, so we're running well there. And then the equity of the hiring process is pretty good. We've weighted that 10%. But the overall experience is, I think, where we've seen the biggest gap because the offer accept rate is so low. We're putting all this work in to create this incredible recruiting process, and the candidates are just not converting into hires. So priority action items. Rejection reason taxonomy. I didn't really cover it, but there was a kind of note a little further up in the chat where it did highlight how the metrics were actually being skewed by how we close recs down and the reasons that we give there. So that's probably more of a data cleanup exercise. But actually by going through this, you're actually going to see experience increase by 20 points. Close offers in 5 business days for engine sales in the US. And so we're looking at if we have the volume of hiring and we make the improvement that we're suggesting here, we're actually going to increase the speed by 8 points here. So that's going to go up to 78. And then Titan Tech to on-site conversion, we're actually going to improve conversion rates by 5 points because only 41% of technical screens advanced to on-site, which should be closer to 65%. So we're going to fix why that's happening, maybe increase the difficulty of the technical recruiter screen, especially if we're using a automated process. To run that, it should just be turning up the dial a little bit so that we're filtering more people out as they go through the funnel, so we're not wasting their time by bringing them on site. We're not wasting a final round interviewers' time by having them interview people who are just not technically up to the right standard. So if we do all these 3 things, we do them well, that's a 33-point improvement, which is going to put us kind of much higher overall, and then weighted average for that will hopefully get us to that 8 points improvement. And that's what we're going to brief to our manager. That's what we're going to brief to the team. That's what we're going to come back to on a kind of weekly, monthly basis. That's how we're going to break out the goals for the month to each individual recruiter. We're actually going to be able to kind of go down and drill into each kind of recruiting process, fix the problems through additional training, through additional workflow process redesign, through additional analytics, maybe incorporating some tools where they're really needed. But this is giving you the benchmarks that are based on your own data, based on your own perception of what an ideal candidate journey looks like, and not just solely looking at what your competitors are doing and then trying to become average within your industry. And this is the way to really kind of take the lead. And we've done it all through Claude, so you don't need a separate recruiting team. Again, you can use any AI tool to do this. I like Claude for Excel because it's already built in. You do so much work in Excel. And once this is saved, you can then come back to it and revisit, and it's going to save that memory so that you can kind of continue to ask questions and continue to drill down without having to go to a separate recruiter analytics team who are probably already overloaded building dashboards for the executive team as well. So that was it for today. I hope that was helpful. Let me know what comments you have in below, and hope to see you on the Talent Academy. Thanks.